You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. I'm here with Jeff Adams. We're at the Watershed Resource Center in Santa Barbara, California. And Jeff, if you could tell us a bit about your company, Terra Sophia, and then we'll get started in our discussion about watersheds.
Great, yeah, thanks for having me, Jill. Yes, my company is Terra Sophia LLC. It's an ecological design, consulting, and education company. And a primary focus is really empowering people to have a more productive and mutually beneficial relationship with their environment and landscape so that they're able to really take a lot of action and create a lot of solutions for themselves.
And I can't wait to learn about some of those actions that people can take. As people in California are probably very well aware that Governor Brown just declared a drought emergency situation here, and I think a lot of the West is suffering from drought.
Yes, it's true. There's drought and a cycle of intense storms and flooding. So the good news is that the same watershed and landscape techniques that can help us with drought are also very good at stormwater mitigation and can help alleviate some flooding issues as well.
And I can't wait to hear more about that. Well, we're here in this beautiful center, and I see this sign, "Where are you in the watershed?" For listeners who may not know, could you give your definition of what a watershed is and why people should care?
Yes, so a watershed is a geographic area draining to a common point, and typically they'll be associated with a river or a body of water, but I like to expand the concept to just say any area draining to a common point so that we can start to see that our roofs and our landscapes also have smaller watersheds within them that are very much within the means of what we are able to manage and steward in a beneficial way that then contributes to the health of the larger watersheds of which we all live in.
So we live on or in a watershed, everyone listening.
Yes, everybody in the world lives in a watershed somewhere, and watersheds can be at very different scales. You could see that the whole Mississippi River is one big watershed, but within that there's many smaller rivers and drainages and tributaries that are also watersheds.
And so what we do to the watershed actually affects water quality of the water all around us.
Yes, it does. So human uses and land use definitely have a big impact on watershed, and not only water quality but also water quantity. And so how we manage vegetation and what type of vegetation we have on a site is going to require a certain amount of water to keep it going, as well as just the different types of surfaces, whether we have vegetation or a parking lot, is going to really influence when that water falls from the sky and rain, how much of it runs off and immediately leaves the site, which is something that we've really exacerbated in recent times as we develop more natural areas, pave things over, put in our buildings. We're really dehydrating the landscape in the upper regions and then flooding or causing erosion in the landscapes in the lower regions as we shift that water balance. So really a big effort is to catch water where it falls and really help to slow it down and let it soak back into the soil so that it can be there for the plantings and slowly recharge our river and aquifer systems.
So Jeff, as I was reading your biography, and I was so interested in your background because I think you started in more conventional landscaping. Can you talk a bit about that and then tell us about indigenous technology?
All right, yeah, so I grew up and work in conventional landscaping, what you might call mow, blow, and go, where you just run around with the lawnmower and then the weed whacker, then the leaf blower, and then get out of there. And so worked in conventional landscaping, did a lot of sort of other trades and carpentry, and just never felt quite right seeing all the waste, seeing that we just did the same thing over and over again, and applied irrigation water to get the grass to grow quicker so we could cut it again to haul it off site, and it just really was a non-sustainable and non-fulfilling cycle. So as I got a little older and got into college, I got turned on to permaculture and appropriate technology, which then led me to study what I came to call indigenous technology, and that's what I designed my degree in at college. And indigenous technology I defined as the practical application of knowledge of a place to help meet the needs of that place. So really looking at what's the wisdom inherent in nature, what are the ecological processes going on here, what did different traditional indigenous peoples do to steward and make their living in these different areas, and how can we use that wisdom in our choices and our land management today, while also including the best of modern technology without just going always for like the high tech, but really kind of finding that blend of the ancient and the modern to create something that's totally new and fit to our places, so that we can best deal with these challenges and opportunities that we're currently facing.
So Jeff, let's talk a bit about watershed-based community resiliency, and what do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is it really starts with an awareness of our current situation, our current infrastructure, and where a lot of our current needs are being met. And if we look at that system, we see that almost everything is imported from somewhere else. Everything's being trucked in, piped in, sent down the power lines, and that makes us, well, have this illusion and in some very real senses this convenient lifestyle, but it also makes us very vulnerable to disruptions. And if we look around the world and even around just in the US, when different natural catastrophes strike, when different economic mechanisms shift, people are vulnerable to be getting cut off from some of those things that we need for our basic sources of subsistence. So when we start thinking about community resilience and watershed-based community resilience, we're really looking at what can we do on our own sites, in our community, in our watersheds, to take some of the strain and reliance off of these large centralized systems and give us a little bit more capacity to respond to change, a little more local food, better control over our local water supplies, and knowing our neighbors and our communities, so that if and when circumstances change, we have a more local network and we're not as dependent on importing something from some other watershed, because that may not always be available as it currently is and as we've currently come to be dependent upon.
How can we turn our landscape into part of the solution, into helping have a more resilient watershed community?
Well, there's a lot of techniques, and first I'd like to just paint a quick picture of what the current landscape is. And so a typical landscape these days is going to be turf grass, typically on one grading often to drain water off-site as fast as possible, with the downspouts coming off the house or roof either directly plumbed out to the street or possibly dumping at the base of the building and causing issues for that building. And then there may be a couple ornamental shrubs and stuff, and all of this landscape really is high maintenance and requires high inputs of water, often chemical fertilizers and petroleum-based products. And so what this landscape is doing is it's taking a lot of resources, and you could say that it is providing us with some aesthetic beauty, and it is green, so there is some vegetative cooling and maybe habitat for some wildlife within there, but it's not really providing us much back for how much it's taking us to maintain that. And so doing different techniques of water harvesting, we can repattern our landscape so that we can direct our roof runoff and possibly even our driveways and patios and other hard surfaces into the landscape, into basins, or what's often referred to as a rain garden, that allow that water to safely pool up and soak into the soil, and that typically happens within a day or less, so that you're not getting mosquito hazards, and we can design so that we're not creating unintended nuisances. And then it becomes a matter of building healthy soil to support healthy plants and getting the right plants in the right place, so that those plants then might still need some additional irrigation water, especially when they're young and just getting established, but ongoing aren't going to require as much water, and will typically can be selected to provide us with additional benefits, such as culinary and medicinal herbs, food, flowers and aesthetics, other pollinator and bird habitat can be incorporated in there. So those are some of the what I see as the low-hanging fruit, is really just kind of getting out there with a shovel and a level and really looking at changing the shape of the land, building healthy soils, and getting in some low water use and multifunctional plantings. And then as we kind of go up typically in costs and in technology, we can look at techniques such as roof water catchment, where we hold the rainwater when it does rain in a tank or a cistern, so that then we can distribute that to the landscape when we want it, or so that we have a backup water supply, so in case of severe drought and mandatory water rationing or a natural disaster, now we have a source of water on site that can be used for those needs. And then there's also gray water, especially from the laundry machine, is a very simple and effective technique that can be sort of seen as the perennial stream, in that we're going to kind of keep using water indoors, and if we can distribute some of that out into our landscape to support our plantings, then we're not going to be as reliant on energy-intensive drinking quality water being pumped in to use to meet those landscape needs.
So you just gave us an amazing amount of information on different strategies that we can use is it almost like you just want to keep your water on site?
Yes, there's some situations where water harvesting may not be appropriate. You typically want to infiltrate water at least 10 feet from a building, and if you're on a steep slope or know that you have either a high groundwater table or shallow soils over bedrock, there's some instances where it might not be appropriate to try to soak extra water into your soil, but in general, the idea is to hold that water on site, slow it down, let it soak into the soil instead of letting it run off and becoming a downstream stormwater pollutant issue.
Because that is a big issue, right, in especially urban areas.
Yes, definitely. Urban runoff, and there's a lot of issues these days. The EPA has really been stepping up their requirements of municipalities to follow the Clean Water Act and really clean up stormwater pollution as a big part of that. And a lot of what's washing down there is kind of oil and antifreeze and drippings from cars and vehicles, runoff from chemical-based landscape maintenance practices, fertilizers, biocides, all of that, as well as pet droppings. So that kind of the scoop your poop campaigns and all those are really big and really important for a reason, because those have been identified in many major cities as one of the leading sources of fecal coliform going untreated into our local waterways, which then can lead to real health issues, beach closures, and all of that has both economic and social health issues associated with it.
And you mentioned chemical pesticides, fertilizers. Those are the type of things that we do not want going into our water.
It's true. I mean, a lot of them, they're really hard for an aquatic ecosystem to process and assimilate those those types of chemicals. Most of those are fossil fuel-based chemicals, so that they require high amounts of embodied energy in them and are often very toxic, usually by design, to certain forms of life. And there's not a lot of understanding about how, when all these start mixing and matching, what's really going on. So we're kind of doing a large-scale chemistry experiment without a lot of control or oversight on it.
And we're the subjects, us and all the critters.
Yes.
So it is ironic how, at least here in this dry Mediterranean climate, when we're paying for water and then when it rains, we just watch it all washing down the street.
Yeah, it's an interesting cycle, especially for a country that is capitalist in nature and pays a lot of attention to financial investments, that we would let all of our free water falling from the sky, which is of a better quality for our plants, run off and become polluted and cause flooding, erosion, and water quality issues downstream, typically at the community scale. And then we pump back water that has been often pulled from distant watersheds, has a lot of energy associated with moving it, has been treated to be suitable for human consumption, and then we spray it on our landscapes. And in doing that, we're often, especially when you see turf grass and sprinkler systems, you can often find a little stream running down the curbside from where a lot of that drinking water has been oversprayed onto the surrounding pavements and then is then running down into the storm drains on dry, sunny days.
Can you, if you live in a place where you have a large area of land and you live in a place where it's okay to capture your rainwater, slow it, spread it, sink it on your land, can you revive underground aquifers, or does that help with that type of thing?
Yeah, there's a really great example down in Arizona that Brad Lancaster highlights in his book, Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond, where a rancher put in thousands of very small rock structures and actually brought back perennial flow into creeks on his ranch in southern Arizona. So it absolutely is possible, and to do so, it requires a scale. So every individual action is absolutely essential, and we need whole neighborhoods and whole towns to really start basically just pay attention to the water cycle and be part of that water cycle again, so that we can get the benefits of our efforts and don't have to deal with as many self-created challenges.
So you mentioned many strategies, and I'd love to go into detail about a couple of them. Out of the ones that you mentioned, and I have this list here, what are some of the, I hate to say easiest, but maybe the most accessible ways for someone who has a regular-sized yard, we'll say, to start contributing to cleaning or improving our water quality and also capturing some of that rain, that free water, free pure water, right?
Right, yeah. So couple things that come to mind is first is a lot of it comes down to observation and just getting out there, especially if it's raining, and seeing where's the water that's coming off your roof going, where's the water that's landing on your parking lot and on your landscape and driveway, where is it currently going, and then starting to see how can some of that water be directed into your landscape areas where it can benefit the plants. And another one is really starting to look at what are you irrigating and how often, and differentiating between purposeful turf and purposeless turf. And I would define purposeless turf as grass that nobody uses unless they're mowing it, fertilizing it, fixing the irrigation, picking up after their pet, or the mailman coming to the front door. And that is a very high resource use that's not getting all of the great benefits that purposeful turf has, which is kids playing, picnic area, sports ball fields, some of those community spaces where it's really nice to have that nice swath of grass, and might in those circumstances justify the use of water and fossil fuel-based equipment to keep it like that. So really having a good, honest look at your landscaping and saying, is this water and resource use worth it? And seeing what some of those alternatives are, especially in California. There's a wonderful palette of native plants and other climate-appropriate plants that do very well with little, if any, supplemental irrigation water once they're established. And that's the big thing, is all plants when they're young and just getting going, and especially if the rains aren't coming as frequently, are going to need some level of supplemental irrigation to get going. But then when done right, put in the right place, are benefiting from rainwater being directed into the landscape, can really get going and need little, if any, ongoing irrigation water after, say, the first 2 or 3 seasons.
So you want to choose plants, if you're in a drought situation, that aren't that thirsty.
Exactly. They're kind of low water use, or there's the big kind of buzzword nowadays is also water-wise landscaping. And so I know a lot of the cities and stuff are supplying some of those plant lists, might even be supplying some rebates to help people transform some of their thirsty landscaping into water-wise landscaping.
And we also have a lot of people interested in edible landscaping. Do the edibles and the water-wise plants, are they often the same plants or very different?
Some of them are the same. Vegetables and annuals tend to be on the higher water use side, but that's a multifunctional, very essential feature of them. So in my mind, using water to grow food, if you don't do it in your yard, some farmer is going to do it somewhere for you, and then it's going to be transported and refrigerated, and you're going to have to buy it from them. So it's kind of all a spectrum where it's okay to use some water for irrigation. It's just be aware of what you're using it for and why, and what some of those multiple functions are. Because
unless you like to eat a lot of grass.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of our culinary, like Mediterranean herbs, grow really well, and once established, the rosemaries, lavenders, oreganos, a lot of those are water-wise, low water use plants. A lot of fruit trees tend to be like medium water use, but depending on the selection of rootstock, there's some efforts being done to really kind of ratchet down the water requirements for orchards, so that it is possible to grow fruits without requiring tons of supplemental irrigation.
One thing that I love the idea of is a rain garden, and you mentioned it. Can you just go into a little bit more detail on what that is?
Yeah, so at its most basic level, a rain garden is a depression or a basin in the landscape with typically a hard surface directed to it. So often that'll be a roof with your downspout directed out into the landscape. It might be your driveway that kind of with some way to intercept the water flowing across it. But then it's just a depression in the landscape that allows the water to pool up so that it slows down and then gives that water a chance to soak in. And then you plant it with typically those climate-appropriate water-wise plantings whose roots will follow the water down and be able to thrive off of that water throughout the year. And so it can also be seen as a sponge garden is another term that's used for that, because we're really trying to turn our whole landscape into a sponge so that every drop of water that falls on it is soaked up and held as best as possible, and additional water that's running off of our surrounding surfaces has an opportunity to also be held in the landscape.
And what about soil building? Because I know the soil microbes tend to come alive when moisture's in the soil. How does soil building, planting, mulch, and things like that help retain water?
Yeah, well, so soil can be seen as the largest and cheapest tank anybody has on their site. Again, remembering that some situations aren't appropriate, and just needing to know your soils and local geology. But the soil particles in interaction with plant roots and soil microbes form pore spaces and kind of mini sponges, so to speak, in the soil that then both hold on to moisture longer as well as allow that moisture to soak deeper into the soil. So they really help feed each other, in that as the soil gets healthier and holds more moisture, roots grow in. As those roots grow deeper, they provide more surface for the soil microbes to form, and they also open up space in the soil to help let that water soak even deeper into the soil. So they it's a positive reinforcing loop that once that biological processes get going, the water holding capacity and infiltration capacity of the landscape can continue to improve over time.
And then mulching too, right, can also?
Right, and so then mulching can be seen as in two ways. One is it's the food that feeds the soil microbes so that the soil party can continue its building process. And then the mulch also helps to stop evaporation from the soil surface back into the air, so that once that water gets in the soil, it's harder for it to just leave and go up into the air. And that's nature has figured that out. If you walk in the forest, it's hard to find bare soil if you're out in a healthy ecosystem. And every ecosystem's different in terms of how much leaf litter and kind of dead plant material falls on the ground to cover the soil. But that's basically the idea of mulching, is keep usually organic material, but you can also use rocks and other materials to cover that soil surface to stop or at least decrease the evaporative processes and water loss through that.
And I feel like no interview about water harvesting would be complete without bringing up swales.
Yeah, so swales is a form, it's similar to a rain garden. The difference is that a swale is by definition an uncompacted ditch on contour. So it follows the level of the land, sort of like if you've ever looked at a topographic map and it has the little squiggly lines that are all level through the landscape. A swale is used to typically intercept a sheet or point source of flow of water and spread it out across the landscape evenly, so then it can soak in over a greater area. And I should just clarify too that that's talking about an on-contour swale, and that's typically what's referred to in permaculture. In some of the construction trades, a swale is also an off-contour ditch along the side of the road that's used to move water along. So there can be some confusion in that, but if you just see it as a typically shallow trench that's used to either hold and spread water in the landscape or to move water a short distance to, say, a rain garden or a basin that's at the end of it.
Are there any other strategies you would want to talk about as far as different strategies to hold the water on site?
Well, we mentioned tanks a little bit, so that's definitely a good option. I would tend to recommend that people first look at ways to decrease their water use in the landscape and do what's typically referred to collectively as passive water harvesting, and that's swales and rain gardens and those types of features. But rain tanks are also a great option that allow you to hold water and then choose when and where you want to use that water later on in the year, so you have a little bit more flexibility over how that water is used. Then there'd be gray water we talked a little bit about, and gray water is all your household water other than toilets and kitchen sink, which are considered black water. So your laundry, your showers, your bathroom sinks, all of those are considered gray water and can legally be put into the landscape in some states. So California allows the reuse of gray water. There's some guidelines that are set up to make sure that somebody's not creating any unintended nuisances or health hazards. Depending on where you are, you may or may not need a permit. So a lot of that's going to be determined at the local level of what those specifics are. But gray water is a great option because it sends what's typically a little bit slightly nutrient-rich water out into the landscape and is really good for perennial plantings, especially fruit trees, if you're really wanting to get some added benefit of the food production out of it.
And then it seems like it would also help you use more natural, or not even natural, but more healthy products for yourself, because those products will go down into your plants.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point, is if you're going to be directing your gray water into the landscape, you really do have to pay attention to what goes down the drain and find those products that are natural and biocompatible so that you don't end up putting out, chemicals or really salts and certain micronutrients become an issue. So there's a range of products that are coming out on the market these days in terms of soaps and laundry detergents that are designed specifically for gray water because it's becoming a really big source and a really big deal.
So these are great ideas and great strategies for a watershed-friendly landscape. What about someone that lives in a very wet climate where it's raining a lot? Do you have any advice for them?
Well, the beauty is it's the same techniques. You have to pay attention to not like waterlogging your soil, but places like Seattle and Portland are really actually leading the way in a lot of these techniques to deal with from a stormwater management and a water quality perspective, where on the other end, a lot of the places in the Southwest and in California are really looking at these strategies also from a water conservation and supplemental supply standpoint. So a lot of these techniques can be very much the same. What's going to change the most is your plant palette and what plants you select to be most appropriate for your climate and landscaping needs.
Jeff, I've heard a lot about green infrastructure. Can you explain that to our listeners?
So green infrastructure is often synonymous with low impact development, and that's really a range of best management practices that includes rain gardens and rain catchment tanks like we've been discussing, but also includes green roofs or vegetated roofs, and that's where you build your structure strong enough to then be able to have a membrane liner, soil, and plants on top of the roof so that the water that's falling on the roof, some of it gets filtered and held in that soil so that there's less being running off into the street. It also includes permeable pavements and permeable asphalts. There's a whole range of techniques that are suitable for roads, parking lots, driveways that allow vehicles to be on them, but also allow water to pass through and soak into the soil. And those will typically have a under layer of basically a gravel-filled basin so that the water has a place to move through the permeable pavement and down through the gravel and then into the surrounding soil. There's also types of basins, which I guess would be a form of rain garden, but that are designed more to be in parkways and along street edges, and those are typically designed where you're either going to cut an existing curb and then excavate out to allow that water that's going down the street to flow off into the parkway, support street side vegetation, shade trees, stuff like that, and soak into the soil, or they can be created intentionally as a bulb out or a traffic calming feature. So there's a lot of multifunctional forms of those, and the Watershed Management Group out of Tucson has done a lot of work with that and has recently been successful in working with the city of Tucson in getting a Green Streets Ordinance passed. So there's a lot of traction and movement in looking at how do we manage the stormwater and that's coming off of our streets and parking lots in a beneficial way, and collectively that's kind of termed green infrastructure or low impact development.
Well, it makes total sense, because then doesn't that water then get filtered? You may have mentioned this with the soil part, but isn't it the soil acts like a biological filter?
Exactly, yeah. There's been research done that's found that getting that street runoff to go into soil, especially with good plantings and mulch, actually can help to break down or absorb different pollutants so that then they're pulled out of the water system. And a soil system in general is far more robust at processing and assimilating these different chemicals and toxins than an aquatic system is. And so there's efforts in a lot of major cities to incorporate green infrastructure throughout the city, or at least in strategic neighborhoods at pilot studies. And it's really a growing trend when we have cities from Philadelphia to Seattle to Albuquerque to Tucson to Los Angeles, all across the nation, really starting to look at these techniques as part of the solution and complementary to what would be considered gray infrastructure. And that's our typical storm drains and maybe a wastewater treatment plant, depending on how that stormwater and sewer systems are integrated or not.
So really what it might take is a multi-pronged approach with citizens doing their part and then cities and governments doing the infrastructure part.
Yes, absolutely. This is definitely one that all hands on deck, and a whole bunch of small projects really can add up to having huge positive benefits. And then, there's a lot for each part, the communities, professionals, as well as government agencies to play a role in supporting this and getting more of these systems on the ground.
And if someone wanted to find out more about your projects or talk to you about having you come out and do an assessment of their property and helping them with capturing some of their water, how can they contact you?
The best would probably be to visit my website, which is www.terrasophia.com, which is TerraSophia.com, and through there you can find my email address and my phone number and learn a little bit more about my company and my services and projects, and get in touch with me that way.
And what do you like most about working with water?
Well, I like that water touches and is part of everything, and so in working with water, it's in a lot of ways it's the life force that's moving through and required for so many other things that we often take for granted to function properly. And so by looking at water, it's a lens to really connect back with place. It's an opportunity to work with people and really get hands-on in the soil, really start getting into the plantings, because that's really want to soak the water in to grow good plants so that they can nourish our bodies and give us opportunities to connect and work with each other and the land in a positive and healing way.
That's nice. And let's just hope that we get some rain, because these things help, I guess, all the tactics we've talked about, but if it doesn't rain, how can you harvest the rain?
Yes, that is the missing ingredient sometimes, is that you do need it to rain. And that's also why gray water is so important, because we're going to keep showering, we're going to keep doing laundry, we're going to keep doing those things. We may do a little bit less of them if conservation measures require, but so gray water becomes really important, and eliminating or decreasing our demand for water. So being more efficient in how we use that water, both indoors and especially in our landscape, because in a lot of places in the West, landscaping can be between 30 to 70% of total annual household water consumption is associated with landscaping. So if we can really see about turning those sprinklers off, changing out some of that grass to more climate appropriate plants, we can still dramatically reduce our water footprint independent of how much it may or may not actually rain.
I know, I wasn't here for the last drought, but I read in the paper that some people actually painted their lawns green.
Yes, that's a last-ditch effort if I've heard one.
Yeah, hopefully it won't get to that point. Thank you so much. This was enlightening, and I learned a lot.
Great, yeah, thanks for having me, Jill.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening. Our first documentary, The Soil Solution, is now available at sustainableworldmedia.com. The Soil Solution is a 28-minute documentary film that explores the potential that healthy soil may hold in reversing climate change. If you visit sustainableworldmedia.com, you can view it online and also purchase it. Thanks so much for your support.